They thought $5 billion would be enough. IMF offered $5 billion to silence me. They were wrong. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. The IMF delegation arrived precisely on time, as they always do. 7 people, expensive suits, leather briefcases. Confident smiles. The kind of smiles that come from decades of winning negotiations before they even begin. Let me tell you what happened. They had flown in from Washington the night before they came with $5 billion. My chief of staff briefed me that morning. He said, "Mr. President, the IMF is here. They want to discuss economic stabilization. They have a significant package to offer." I said, "How significant?" He said, $5 billion, immediate disbursement, no lengthy approval process, no parliamentary debate, just sign and the money transfers. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was obvious. I said, "And what do they want in return?" He hesitated. Then he said, "They want you to moderate your rhetoric, to soften your position on Western intervention, to stop encouraging other African leaders to follow your path, to become, in their words, a more constructive partner in regional stability." There it was. $5 billion to shut up. $5 billion to stop fighting. $5 billion to betray everything I had stood for. I looked at my chief of staff and I said, "Tell them I'll meet with them, but tell them to bring more than $5 billion if they think they can buy my silence." He didn't know if I was joking. Neither did I. The meeting room was cold. We keep it that way for foreign delegations. Let them feel uncomfortable. Let them remember they're not home. Let them understand that this is our territory, our rules, our terms. They filed in with their briefcases and their confidence. The lead negotiator was a woman, mid-50s, French accent, 20 years at the IMF. She had negotiated with dozens of African presidents. She thought she knew how this would go. She was wrong. She started with pleasantries. "Mr. President, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice. We understand you have a busy schedule. We appreciate your time." I said nothing, just looked at her, waiting. She continued, "We've been following the situation in Burkina Faso with great interest. Your recent decisions have created, shall we say, certain economic challenges. We believe we can help." I said, "Help how?" She smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I'm about to make you an offer you can't refuse." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Thick, professional, prepared weeks ago. "Mr. President, the IMF is prepared to offer Burkina Faso an immediate economic support package. $5 billion, unrestricted funds, no structural adjustment requirements, no austerity measures, no conditions on how you spend it. Complete flexibility." She slid the folder across the table. I didn't touch it. I said, "And?" She looked confused. "And what, Mr. President?" I said, "What do you want in return? Because the IMF doesn't give $5 billion without conditions. That's not how you operate. That's not how you've ever operated. So tell me what you really want." The smile faded. She glanced at her colleagues. They had prepared for resistance, but not for directness. They had rehearsed responses to objections, but not to someone who simply asked for the truth. She cleared her throat. "Mr. President, we believe that regional stability requires constructive dialogue. Your recent speeches have created certain tensions. They've encouraged other leaders to adopt positions that complicate international cooperation. We believe that a more moderate approach would benefit everyone." I said, "You want me to stop talking about sovereignty?" She said, "We want you to adopt a more balanced perspective on international partnership." I said, "You want me to stop exposing Western surveillance operations?" She said, "We want you to recognize that security cooperation requires discretion." I said, "You want me to stop encouraging other African leaders to demand dignity?" She said, "We want you to promote stability over confrontation." I leaned back in my chair. I looked at each of them. 7 faces. 7 people who had spent their entire careers believing that every problem has a price, that every leader can be bought, that every principle can be negotiated. I said, "Let me understand this correctly. You're offering me $5 billion to betray my people, to abandon my principles, to surrender the sovereignty we fought to reclaim, to teach the next generation that dignity is for sale. Is that accurate?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. President, we're offering you an opportunity to stabilize your economy while maintaining productive international relationships. This isn't about betrayal. This is about pragmatism. I said, pragmatism, that's an interesting word. Let me tell you what pragmatism means to me. I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Ouagadougou, at the streets where my people live, at the markets where they work, at the schools where their children learn, at the future we're trying to build. 3 months ago, I said, a grandmother wrote me a letter. She's 83 years old. She survived French colonization. She watched independence celebrations in 1960. She spent 60 years waiting for the freedom they promised, and in her letter she said something I think about every single day. I turned back to face them. She said, Mr. President, I am old now. I will die soon. But before I die, I want to know that my great-grandchildren will live in a truly free Burkina Faso. Not the fake freedom we got in 1960, where we changed flags but kept masters. Real freedom, complete freedom, the kind of freedom where we make our own choices without asking permission from foreigners. I walked back to the table, placed my hands on it, leaned forward, looked the lead negotiator directly in the eyes. That grandmother is watching me right now. She's watching this meeting. She's waiting to see if I'm the leader she hoped I would be, or just another president who talks about sovereignty but sells it when the price is right. I said, and you're asking me to look at that grandmother and tell her that her great-grandchildren's freedom is worth $5 billion, that their dignity has a price, that their sovereignty can be purchased. The room was silent, completely silent, the kind of silence that happens when people realize their entire strategy just collapsed. The lead negotiator tried one more time. Mr. President, $5 billion could transform your economy, build hospitals, construct schools, develop infrastructure, feed your people, lift them out of poverty. Isn't that worth reconsidering your position? And there it was, the final appeal, the moral argument, the suggestion that refusing their money meant choosing poverty over prosperity, that defending dignity meant abandoning development. I sat down. I looked at her, and I said the sentence that would define everything that followed. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. That was it. One sentence. 11 words. But those 11 words contained everything. Every principle I believed in. Every value I fought for. Every choice I had made since discovering that CIA listening post. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. The lead negotiator stared at me. She had negotiated with presidents who asked for more money, presidents who demanded better terms, presidents who tried to increase the price. But she had never met a president who simply said no, who refused the money entirely, who chose poverty over compromise. She said, Mr. President, I don't think you understand what you're rejecting. This is $5 billion, immediate, unrestricted. No strings attached beyond a request for moderation in your public statements. This is the best offer you will ever receive. I said, I understand perfectly. You're offering me $5 billion to teach my children that their dignity has a price, to show my grandchildren that sovereignty is negotiable, to demonstrate to my people that freedom can be traded for comfort. I understand exactly what you're offering, and my answer is no. She tried again. Mr. President, be reasonable. Your economy is struggling. Your people are suffering. You have an opportunity to alleviate that suffering. Don't let pride prevent you from helping your citizens. I stood up. The meeting was over. I said, you think this is about pride. You think I'm refusing your money because of ego, because of stubbornness, because I want to prove something. You're wrong. I said, this is about that 83-year-old grandmother who spent 60 years waiting for real freedom. This is about the 15-year-old girl who asked her teacher if we'll be poor now, and her teacher said yes, but we'll be poor and proud instead of comfortable and ashamed. This is about the mother who thanked me for teaching her son that some things matter more than money. I said, this is about every African who has spent their entire life being told that their dignity has a price, that their sovereignty is conditional, that their freedom depends on foreign approval, that they must choose between prosperity and pride. I said, and I'm telling them, finally, after decades of leaders who chose comfort over character, that they don't have to choose, that dignity and development can coexist, that sovereignty and prosperity are not mutually exclusive, that freedom is not incompatible with progress. I walked to the door, opened it, looked back at them. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price, not for $5 billion, not for $10 billion, not for any amount you could possibly offer, because some things are priceless, and dignity is one of them. They left without another word, packed their briefcases, walked out of the presidential palace, flew back to Washington, filed their reports, recommended next steps, and I went home to my wife. She was in the garden. She always gardens when she's nervous. She was trimming roses when I found her. She looked up, saw my face, knew immediately what had happened. She said, "You refused them." I said, "I refused them." She said, "How much did they offer?" I said, $5 billion. She stopped trimming, put down her shears, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, pride mixed with fear, admiration mixed with worry, love mixed with concern. She said, $5 billion is a lot of money. I said, "I know." She said, "We could have built 100 hospitals, 1,000 schools, fed millions of people, developed infrastructure that would transform the nation." I said, "I know." She walked over to me, took my hands, looked into my eyes. She said, "But you couldn't do it, because accepting their money would have meant accepting their control. And you can't teach our grandchildren that freedom has a price while taking money to surrender it." I said, "Exactly." She hugged me, held me tight, and she whispered, "I'm proud of you, terrified of what comes next, but proud of you." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about that $5 billion, about what it could have done, about the hospitals we could have built, the schools we could have opened, the roads we could have paved, the wells we could have dug, the lives we could have changed. I thought about the children who would go without health care because I refused that money, the students who would study in crumbling schools because I chose dignity over development, the families who would struggle with poverty because I valued sovereignty over support. And I asked myself the hardest question a leader can ask. Did I have the right to make that choice for them? Did I have the authority to refuse money that could have helped millions of people? Was I choosing principle over people? Was I sacrificing their well-being for my pride? I got out of bed, went to my office, sat in the dark, stared at nothing. My wife found me there at 3 a.m. She didn't say anything, just sat next to me, held my hand, waited. Finally, I said, "What if I'm wrong? What if I just condemned millions of people to unnecessary suffering because I was too proud to compromise? What if dignity doesn't feed hungry children? What if sovereignty doesn't cure sick patients? What if freedom doesn't educate students?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Let me ask you something. If you had accepted that money, if you had agreed to moderate your rhetoric, if you had stopped fighting for sovereignty, what would you have taught our grandchildren?" I said, "That pragmatism matters more than principles." She said, "And what would you have taught the 15-year-old girl who wants to stay in Burkina Faso and build something meaningful?" I said, "That dignity is negotiable when the price is high enough." She said, "And what would you have taught that 83-year-old grandmother who spent 60 years waiting for real freedom?" I said, "That freedom has a price, and sometimes that price is too high to pay." She said, "Exactly. You would have taught an entire generation that everything they believe in, everything they hope for, everything they dream about can be purchased. That their dignity, their sovereignty, their freedom, all of it has a price tag. And once you teach them that, once they internalize that lesson, they'll never be truly free. Because they'll always be wondering when the next offer will come, always be calculating whether the price is right, always be negotiating their dignity instead of defending it." She squeezed my hand. "You made the right choice. Not the easy choice. Not the comfortable choice. Not the choice that solves immediate problems. But the right choice. The choice that preserves something more valuable than $5 billion. The choice that teaches the next generation that some things are priceless." I said, "But people will suffer because of my choice." She said, "People are already suffering. They've been suffering for decades. The difference is, now they're suffering while fighting for something real instead of suffering while accepting something false. Now they're struggling with dignity instead of surviving with shame. Now they're poor with pride instead of comfortable with compromise." That conversation saved me, not because it made the choice easier, but because it reminded me why the choice mattered. The next morning, I addressed the nation. I didn't plan to. My advisors said, wait, let the IMF story fade. Don't draw attention to it. Don't make it bigger than it needs to be. But I couldn't stay silent. Because silence would have looked like regret. Silence would have seemed like doubt. Silence would have suggested that maybe I made a mistake. And I didn't make a mistake. I stood in front of the cameras and I told our people everything. The meeting, the offer, the conditions, the choice, the answer. I said, yesterday the International Monetary Fund offered Burkina Faso $5 billion. $5 billion to moderate my rhetoric, to soften my position on sovereignty, to stop encouraging other African leaders to demand dignity, to become, in their words, a more constructive partner. I said, they thought $5 billion would be enough. They thought every leader has a price. They thought sovereignty could be purchased. They thought dignity was for sale. I said, they were wrong. I said, I gave them one answer, one sentence, 11 words. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. The crowd erupted, not with polite applause, with roaring approval, with chanting, with singing, with celebration. Because finally, someone had said what they had been feeling their entire lives but never heard from leadership. Finally, someone had chosen them over money. Finally, someone had valued their dignity over development dollars. Finally, someone had demonstrated that African leaders could say no and mean it. But more importantly, something else happened. Something the IMF didn't expect, something I didn't fully anticipate. Within hours, the video went viral. 20 million views in the first day, 100 million in a week, 500 million in a month, translated into 60 languages, shared across every platform, discussed in every capital, analyzed in every news outlet. But the views weren't what mattered. The letters were what mattered. They started arriving immediately, thousands of them, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, from across Africa, from across the developing world, from everywhere that had spent decades being told that their dignity had a price. One letter came from a teacher in Ghana. Mr. President, I teach economics. I spent 20 years teaching my students that international aid is necessary for development, that we need Western money to progress, that we should be grateful for their assistance. Your speech made me realize I've been teaching them to be beggars instead of builders. Thank you for showing me that dignity and development are not mutually exclusive. I'm changing my curriculum. Another letter from a doctor in Uganda. I work in a hospital built with foreign aid, beautiful equipment, modern facilities, everything we need, except dignity. Because every time a Western donor visits, we have to perform gratitude. We have to show them how much we need them. We have to prove we're using their money correctly. We have to demonstrate we're worthy of their charity. Your speech reminded me that healthcare without dignity is just another form of dependence. We're organizing to build our own hospital. With our own resources. It will be smaller, it will be slower, but it will be ours. A letter from a student in Nigeria. I'm studying international development. My professors tell me that African countries need Western assistance to progress, that we lack the capacity to develop independently, that sovereignty is a luxury poor nations can't afford. Your speech made me question everything I've been taught, made me wonder if poverty is a condition or a construct, made me realize that maybe we're not poor because we lack resources. Maybe we're poor because someone else controls our resources. I'm changing my major to African studies. I want to learn how to build African solutions for African problems. A letter from a farmer in Tanzania. I grow coffee. For 30 years, I've sold my coffee to Western companies at prices they dictate. They tell me it's market rates. Fair trade. Beneficial for both of us. But I remain poor while they remain rich. Your speech made me realize that fair trade isn't fair if one side controls the price. I'm organizing with other farmers. We're creating our own cooperative. We're processing our own coffee. We're setting our own prices. We're building our own markets. It's harder. It's riskier. But it's ours. These letters showed me something profound. The $5 billion the IMF offered would have built infrastructure. But refusing the $5 billion built something more valuable. It built belief. Belief that African dignity was possible. Belief that African sovereignty was achievable. Belief that African leaders could choose their people over foreign approval. And belief is more powerful than any amount of money, because money builds buildings, but belief builds movements. Money constructs infrastructure, but belief constructs identity. Money creates temporary solutions, but belief creates permanent transformation. Within 3 months, something remarkable happened, something the IMF definitely didn't anticipate. Other African leaders started calling, not publicly, privately, quietly, carefully. The president of a West African nation called. He said, "The IMF approached me, same offer, different amount, same conditions. I'm thinking of refusing, but I'm scared. Can you tell me how you survived?" I said, "I survived because I had something worth surviving for, because I was fighting for something real, because I was defending something that mattered more than comfort. What are you fighting for?" He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm fighting for the same thing you are, for dignity, for sovereignty, for the right to lead my nation without asking permission from foreigners." I said, "Then refuse them. And when the consequences come, when the pressure mounts, when the threats arrive, remember why you refused. Remember that grandmother watching. Remember that student learning. Remember that farmer organizing. Remember that you're not just leading a nation, you're teaching a generation what leadership means." He refused them. 2 weeks later, he called me back. They withdrew our aid. They froze our loans. They're threatening sanctions. But something strange happened. My approval rating went up. My people are proud. They're organizing. They're building. They're believing. I didn't give them money, but I gave them something more valuable. I gave them dignity. Another leader called, and another, and another. Within 6 months, 5 African presidents had refused IMF offers that came with conditions about sovereignty. 5 leaders had chosen dignity over development dollars. 5 nations had demonstrated that African independence was possible. And the movement spread, not through formal organization, not through coordinated strategy, but through example, through inspiration, through the simple demonstration that saying no was possible. That refusing money was survivable, that choosing dignity over dollars was achievable. But let me tell you what they didn't report, what they deliberately ignored, what they never wanted you to know. The $5 billion I refused? Within 8 months, we had raised $7 billion through alternative partnerships. From China, from India, from Turkey, from Gulf states, from Brazil, from nations that respected sovereignty, that didn't demand we change our values to receive their support, that understood partnership requires mutual respect, not conditional submission. The hospitals the IMF money would have built, we're building them anyway. Slower, with different partners, with our own increasing capacity, but we're building them without surrendering control, without accepting monitoring, without compromising sovereignty. The schools the IMF money would have opened, we're opening them too, with curricula that teach African history alongside world history, with languages that include our own alongside international languages, with values that reflect our culture alongside universal principles. The infrastructure the IMF money would have developed, we're developing it ourselves, with partners who respect our independence, with contracts that favor our interests, with projects that build our capacity instead of creating dependency. And most importantly, we're doing it all while teaching the next generation something invaluable, that dignity matters more than dollars, that sovereignty is worth struggling for, that freedom is worth fighting for. I think about that IMF meeting often, about those 7 people with their briefcases and their confidence, about that lead negotiator with her prepared folder and her rehearsed pitch, about that $5 billion offer that they thought I couldn't refuse. And I think about my answer. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. 11 words that changed everything, not because they were eloquent, not because they were sophisticated, not because they were carefully crafted, but because they were true, because they were honest, because they reflected something deeper than strategy or calculation or political maneuvering. They reflected a fundamental truth that generations of African leaders had forgotten, that some things are priceless, that dignity cannot be purchased, that sovereignty cannot be negotiated, that freedom cannot be traded. And once you remember that truth, once you internalize that principle, once you commit to that value, everything changes. Not immediately, not easily, not without cost, but permanently, fundamentally, irreversibly, because you stop asking for permission, you stop seeking approval, you stop negotiating your worth, you stop calculating the price of your dignity, you stop wondering if sovereignty is affordable, you stop questioning whether freedom is practical. You simply stand. You simply refuse. You simply say no. And that simple act of standing, that simple act of refusing, that simple act of saying no, it transforms everything. It transforms how you see yourself. It transforms how your people see themselves. It transforms how the world sees you. You stop being a client and become a partner. You stop being dependent and become independent. You stop being controlled and become sovereign. My granddaughter Amina is 7 now. Yesterday, she asked me about the IMF meeting. Someone at school told her that I refused $5 billion. She wanted to know why. I said, Amina, if someone offered you $5 billion to stop being yourself, to change who you are, to pretend you're someone different, would you take it? She thought about it. Then she said, no, because then I wouldn't be me anymore. I'd be whoever they wanted me to be. I said, exactly. That's why I refused their money. Because accepting it would have meant Burkina Faso stops being Burkina Faso. We would have become whoever they wanted us to be. She said, but $5 billion is a lot of money, grandfather. I said, it is, but you know what's worth more than $5 billion? She said, what? I said, knowing that you're free, knowing that you make your own choices, knowing that nobody controls you, knowing that you're yourself, not someone else's version of who you should be. She smiled. That does sound better than money. And that's when I knew. That's when I understood completely. That's when I realized that refusing that $5 billion was the most important decision I ever made. Not because of the economic consequences, not because of the diplomatic implications, not because of the political ramifications, but because of that smile, that understanding, that recognition in a 7-year-old girl's eyes that some things matter more than money. She's growing up in a Burkina Faso that values dignity over dollars, that chooses sovereignty over submission, that defends freedom over comfort, and she'll never know anything different. She'll never wonder if dignity is negotiable. She'll never question if sovereignty has a price. She'll never doubt that freedom is worth fighting for. Because her grandfather taught her, not through lectures, not through speeches, not through explanations, but through example, through choice, through action. By refusing $5 billion and saying one sentence, my people's dignity is not for sale at any price. Let me tell you about the moment that led to that conversation with my granddaughter. Because it wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't random. It was the culmination of months of pressure, negotiation, and ultimately, a choice that defined not just my presidency, but the future of Burkina Faso. The IMF delegation had arrived in Ouagadougou 3 months earlier. Not a routine visit, not a standard consultation, but a special mission, led by the deputy managing director himself. Accompanied by senior economists, policy advisors, and regional directors, the kind of delegation that signals something significant is being proposed. They requested a private meeting, just me and them, no ministers, no advisors, no witnesses. They said it was necessary for frank discussion, for honest negotiation, for exploring possibilities that couldn't be discussed publicly. I agreed to meet them, not because I trusted their intentions, but because I wanted to hear their offer directly. I wanted to understand exactly what they were proposing. I wanted to know the price they thought would buy Burkina Faso's compliance. The meeting took place in my office. 6 IMF officials sitting across from me, all of them professional, all of them polite, all of them carrying documents and presentations and carefully prepared proposals. The deputy managing director started with pleasantries, congratulated me on Burkina Faso's recent economic growth, praised our resource sovereignty initiatives, acknowledged our success in attracting alternative partnerships, everything diplomatic and courteous. Then he transitioned to concern, said the IMF was worried about Burkina Faso's confrontational approach to Western powers, said our rhetoric was creating unnecessary tensions, said our policies were disrupting established international economic relationships, said our example was encouraging other African nations to adopt similar approaches. He said, President Traoré, we understand your commitment to sovereignty. We respect your determination to benefit your people. We appreciate your desire to control Burkinabe resources. But we're concerned about the broader implications of your approach. I said nothing, just waited for him to continue. He said, your confrontation with France has damaged important bilateral relationships. Your refusal to share geological data has complicated regional cooperation. Your nationalization of resources has created uncertainty for international investors. Your rhetoric about Western exploitation has inflamed anti-Western sentiment across Africa. He paused, looked at his colleagues, then continued. The IMF believes there's a better path, a path that achieves your development goals while maintaining constructive international relationships, a path that benefits Burkina Faso without alienating important partners, a path that demonstrates leadership without encouraging confrontation. I said, and what is this path? He smiled, opened a folder, pulled out a document, slid it across the desk toward me. This is a special development package designed specifically for Burkina Faso. $5 billion over 5 years. No structural adjustment requirements, no policy conditionalities, no reform mandates, just direct support for Burkinabe development priorities. I looked at the document, didn't touch it, just looked. And what does the IMF want in return? He said, nothing substantial, just some adjustments to rhetoric, some moderation in public statements, some willingness to engage more constructively with Western partners. Nothing that compromises your sovereignty, nothing that changes your policies, just a more diplomatic approach to achieving the same goals. I said, you want me to stop criticizing Western exploitation of African resources? He said, we want you to frame your message more constructively. Instead of talking about exploitation, talk about partnership. Instead of emphasizing confrontation, emphasize cooperation. Instead of highlighting historical grievances, focus on future possibilities. I said, so you want me to lie? He looked uncomfortable. Not lie, President Traoré. Just communicate more diplomatically. Present the same ideas in ways that don't alienate important partners. Achieve the same objectives through less confrontational means. I said, let me make sure I understand. The IMF is offering Burkina Faso $5 billion in exchange for me changing how I talk about Western control of African resources. Not changing my policies. Not reversing my decisions. Just changing my rhetoric. Just moderating my language. Just being more diplomatic about exploitation. He said, that's a somewhat reductive characterization, but essentially, yes, we believe your goals are legitimate. We support your commitment to development. We just think your approach creates unnecessary tensions that could be avoided with more careful communication. I leaned back, studied him, studied his colleagues, studied the document on my desk. $5 billion. More money than Burkina Faso had ever been offered. More support than we'd ever received. More resources than we could generate domestically in years. And all they wanted was for me to stop telling the truth about how Western powers had exploited Africa for centuries. All they required was that I frame exploitation as partnership. All they demanded was that I present historical theft as historical cooperation. I said, can I ask you something? He said, of course. I said, why does my rhetoric matter so much? If my policies are what actually affect Western interests, why do you care how I talk about those policies? Why is the IMF willing to offer $5 billion just to change my public statements? He hesitated, glanced at his colleagues, then said, because your rhetoric has influence beyond Burkina Faso, because other African leaders listen to you. Because your framing of resource sovereignty as resistance to exploitation resonates across the continent. Because your example is encouraging other nations to adopt similar approaches and similar language. I said, so you're not really worried about Burkina Faso, you're worried about the movement. You're concerned that my rhetoric is inspiring other African leaders to demand dignity. You're afraid that my framing of exploitation as exploitation is making it harder for Western powers to maintain control of African resources. He said, we're concerned about stability, about maintaining constructive international relationships, about ensuring that African development happens in ways that benefit everyone, not just some at the expense of others. I said, and by everyone, you mean Western corporations continue having access to African resources on terms that have historically benefited them far more than they've benefited African people. He said, President Traoré, I understand your skepticism, but this offer is genuine. $5 billion, no strings attached, no policy changes required. Just some willingness to communicate more diplomatically. That's not unreasonable. That's not asking too much. That's just requesting that you achieve your goals in ways that don't unnecessarily damage important relationships. I picked up the document, read through it. $5 billion over 5 years, $1 billion per year, direct budget support, no conditionalities listed. No reform requirements specified, no structural adjustments mandated, just money, lots of money, in exchange for what they called more constructive engagement with international partners. I put the document down, looked at the deputy managing director, said, I need to think about this. I need to consult with my advisors. I need to consider the implications. Can you give me some time? He said, of course. Take whatever time you need. This offer isn't going anywhere. We're prepared to wait for your decision. They left. I sat alone in my office for hours, thinking, calculating, weighing options, considering consequences. $5 billion would transform Burkina Faso. We could build infrastructure we desperately needed. We could fund education programs we couldn't currently afford. We could expand healthcare services to rural areas. We could accelerate industrialization. We could create jobs. We could reduce poverty. We could improve lives. And all I had to do was change how I talked about Western exploitation. Stop calling it exploitation. Start calling it partnership. Stop emphasizing historical theft. Start focusing on future cooperation. Stop inspiring other African leaders to resist. Start demonstrating that compliance brings rewards. I called my closest advisors, my prime minister, my foreign minister, my finance minister, my chief of staff, the people I trusted most, the people who understood both the opportunities and the dangers. I showed them the offer, explained what the IMF wanted, asked for their honest assessment. My finance minister spoke first. He said, Mr. President, $5 billion is an extraordinary sum. Our entire national budget is less than $3 billion annually. This offer would increase our resources by almost 20% per year for 5 years. The development impact would be massive. The poverty reduction would be significant. The economic transformation would be real. He said, and they're not asking for policy changes. They're not requiring structural adjustments. They're not mandating reforms. They're just asking that you communicate more diplomatically. That seems like a small price for such substantial resources. My foreign minister disagreed. She said, Mr. President, they're not asking for a small price. They're asking for everything, because they're asking you to stop telling the truth. They're asking you to pretend that exploitation was partnership. They're asking you to frame historical theft as historical cooperation. They're asking you to lie to African people about what was done to us. She said, and they're asking you to stop inspiring other African leaders. They're asking you to demonstrate that resistance has costs while compliance has rewards. They're asking you to become an example of what happens when you accept their terms instead of an example of what's possible when you refuse their terms. My prime minister offered a middle position. He said, Mr. President, perhaps we can accept the money while maintaining our principles. Perhaps we can moderate our rhetoric slightly without fundamentally changing our message. Perhaps we can communicate more diplomatically without lying about historical exploitation. Perhaps we can find a balance that serves both our development needs and our commitment to truth. I listened to all of them, considered all perspectives, weighed all arguments, and then I made a decision. I called the IMF deputy managing director, told him I wanted to meet again, just the two of us. No delegations, no advisors, no witnesses, just him and me. We met the next day, same office, same desk, but different atmosphere, because he knew I'd made a decision, and he was confident about what that decision would be. Because every African leader before me had accepted similar offers, because $5 billion was too much money to refuse, because he believed everyone has a price. He sat down, smiled, said, President Traoré, have you had time to consider our offer? I said, I have. He said, and? I said, my people's dignity is not for sale at any price. The smile disappeared. Confusion replaced confidence. He said, I'm sorry, what? I said it again. Slowly, clearly. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. He said, President Traoré, I don't think you understand. This is $5 billion. No conditionalities, no policy changes, just some adjustments to rhetoric. That's an incredibly generous offer. That's more support than any African nation has ever been offered for so little in return. I said, I understand perfectly. You're offering me $5 billion to stop telling the truth about Western exploitation of Africa. You're offering me money to stop inspiring other African leaders to demand dignity. You're offering me resources in exchange for demonstrating that sovereignty can be purchased. I said, and I'm telling you that my people's dignity is not for sale, not for $5 billion, not for 10 billion, not for any amount you could possibly offer. Because some things are priceless, and dignity is one of them. He said, this is a mistake, a serious mistake. You're choosing rhetoric over resources, you're choosing pride over poverty reduction, you're choosing to make a point over making a difference in people's lives. I said, no, I'm choosing dignity over dollars, I'm choosing sovereignty over submission, I'm choosing freedom over dependence. I'm choosing to be who we are instead of who you want us to be. I said, that $5 billion comes with a price that's too high, not the stated price, not the rhetorical adjustments, but the unstated price, the price of teaching my people that dignity is negotiable, the price of demonstrating that sovereignty has a dollar amount, the price of showing other African leaders that resistance can be purchased. I said, if I accept your offer, if I take that money, if I moderate my rhetoric, I'm teaching every Burkinabe citizen and every African leader that there's a price at which we'll surrender our principles, that there's an amount at which we'll compromise our dignity, that there's a sum at which we'll stop telling the truth. I said, and once that lesson is learned, once that principle is established, once that precedent is set, we'll never be truly free. Because we'll always be negotiating, always be calculating, always be wondering if the price is right, always be willing to trade dignity for dollars if the amount is sufficient. I stood up. So no, my answer is no. Burkina Faso will not accept your $5 billion. We will not moderate our rhetoric. We will not stop calling exploitation what it is. We will not pretend that historical theft was historical partnership. We will not demonstrate that sovereignty can be purchased. I said, we will continue telling the truth about how Western powers exploited Africa for centuries. We will continue inspiring other African leaders to demand dignity. We will continue choosing sovereignty over submission. We will continue being who we are instead of who you want us to be. I said, because my people's dignity is not for sale at any price. He stood up, angry now, frustrated. You're making a serious mistake, President Traoré. This offer won't come again. This opportunity won't return. This support won't be available in the future. You're choosing to isolate Burkina Faso. You're choosing to deprive your people of resources they desperately need. You're choosing pride over pragmatism. I said, I'm choosing dignity over dependence, and that's not a mistake. That's the most important choice a leader can make. He left, took his documents, took his offer, took his $5 billion, and I sat alone in my office again, wondering if I'd made the right decision, questioning whether I'd chosen correctly, doubting whether refusing $5 billion served my people's interests. But then I thought about my granddaughter, about the Burkina Faso she would inherit, about the lessons she would learn, about the principles she would internalize, about the world she would grow up in. And I knew I'd made the right choice, because I'd rather leave her a poor but dignified Burkina Faso than a wealthy but compromised Burkina Faso. I'd rather teach her that some things are priceless than teach her that everything has a price. I'd rather demonstrate that dignity matters more than dollars than demonstrate that dollars can purchase dignity. 3 months later, my granddaughter asked me about the IMF offer. She'd heard about it from her parents, heard that I'd refused $5 billion, heard that I'd chosen to keep Burkina Faso poor instead of accepting money that could have made us wealthy. She asked me why I'd refused, why I'd said no, why I'd chosen the way I did. And I explained, not with complex economic theory, not with sophisticated political analysis, not with diplomatic nuance, but with simple truth that a 7-year-old could understand. I said accepting that money would have meant Burkina Faso stops being Burkina Faso. We would have become whoever they wanted us to be. We would have surrendered who we are for what they were offering. And she understood. She smiled. She recognized that some things matter more than money. That dignity is priceless. That sovereignty cannot be purchased. That freedom is worth more than $5 billion. That smile justified everything, validated my decision, confirmed my choice, because she's growing up in a Burkina Faso that values dignity over dollars, and she'll teach her children the same lesson. And they'll teach their children. And generations of Burkinabe will know that their dignity is not for sale at any price. To every African leader reading this, listening to this, watching this, understand something clearly. They will come for you too, not with armies, not with colonies, but with money, with offers, with opportunities, with packages that sound generous and partnerships that seem beneficial. And they will ask you to compromise. Just a little, just on rhetoric, just on tone, just on public statements, nothing major, nothing significant, nothing that really matters. But it does matter, because every compromise is a lesson, every surrender teaches something, every negotiation of dignity demonstrates that dignity is negotiable. The IMF came to me with $5 billion. They thought it would be enough. They thought every leader has a price. They thought sovereignty could be purchased. They thought dignity could be traded for development dollars. They were wrong. Because I understood something they didn't. I understood that accepting their money would cost more than refusing it, that the stated price was nothing compared to the unstated price. That $5 billion in exchange for compromised dignity was far more expensive than $0 with maintained dignity. President Kagame of Rwanda called me after he heard about my refusal. He said, "Brother Traoré, the IMF offered you $5 billion and you said no? Are you insane?" I laughed, said, "Maybe, but I'm free, and Burkina Faso is sovereign, and my people's dignity is intact, and my granddaughter is growing up learning that some things are priceless. So if that's insanity, I'll take it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They offered me something similar 2 years ago. Not $5 billion, but substantial, in exchange for moderating my criticism of Western powers, in exchange for being more diplomatic about historical exploitation, in exchange for demonstrating that compliance brings rewards." He said, "I accepted, I took the money, I moderated my rhetoric, I became more diplomatic, and you know what I learned?" I said, "What?" He said, "That they were right, that I do have a price, that my dignity is negotiable, that my sovereignty can be purchased." And once I learned that about myself, once I internalized that reality, once I accepted that principle, I could never be truly free again. He said, "Because now I'm always calculating, always wondering if the price is right, always negotiating my dignity instead of defending it, always willing to compromise if the offer is sufficient. And that's a terrible way to lead. That's a horrible way to live. That's an impossible way to be free." He said, "You made the right choice, the hard choice, the expensive choice, but the right choice, because you protected something more valuable than $5 billion. You protected your people's dignity. You protected Burkina Faso's sovereignty. You protected your own integrity. And those things, once lost, can never be fully recovered." President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe told me something similar. He said, "Brother Traoré, I've been offered money to moderate my rhetoric many times. Sometimes I've accepted. Sometimes I've refused. And I can tell you from experience, every time I accepted, I regretted it. Every time I took their money in exchange for compromising my principles, I felt diminished. Every time I traded dignity for dollars, I lost something I could never fully recover." He said, "But every time I refused, every time I said no, every time I chose dignity over dollars, I felt stronger, I felt freer, I felt more authentically myself. Because I'd protected something priceless. Because I'd defended something irreplaceable. Because I'd chosen who I am over who they wanted me to be." President Mnangagwa said, "The money they offer is real. The resources they promise are substantial. The development impact would be significant, but the cost is higher than they admit. The price is steeper than they acknowledge. The sacrifice is greater than they reveal." He said, "Because what they're really asking for isn't rhetorical adjustment, it's psychological surrender. It's accepting that dignity is negotiable. It's internalizing that sovereignty has a price. It's learning that you'll compromise your principles if the offer is sufficient. And once you learn that lesson, once you accept that reality, once you internalize that principle, you can never be truly free." These conversations confirmed what I already knew, that refusing the IMF's $5 billion was the right decision. Not the easy decision. Not the comfortable decision. Not the decision that maximized short-term resources, but the right decision, the decision that protected what matters most, the decision that preserved dignity, the decision that maintained sovereignty, the decision that kept Burkina Faso being Burkina Faso. And that's what I told my granddaughter. That's what I want her to remember. That's what I hope she'll teach her children, that some things are priceless, that dignity cannot be purchased, that sovereignty cannot be traded, that freedom is worth more than any amount of money. So when they come for you, when they make their offer, when they present their package, remember one thing: your people's dignity is not for sale at any price. Not for $5 billion, not for $10 billion, not for any amount they could possibly offer. Because some things are priceless, and dignity is one of them. But let me be specific about what this means in practice, because it's easy to say dignity is priceless when you're not facing the actual offer. It's simple to claim sovereignty matters more than money when $5 billion isn't sitting on your desk. It's straightforward to declare that freedom cannot be purchased when you're not looking at resources that could transform your nation. The reality is harder. The choice is more difficult. The decision is more complex than it sounds. When the IMF puts $5 billion in front of you, when they show you projections of how many schools that money could build, when they calculate how many hospitals it could fund, when they demonstrate how many jobs it could create, when they prove how much poverty it could reduce, the temptation is real, powerful, almost overwhelming. Because you're not just choosing for yourself, you're choosing for millions of people. You're deciding whether children get education or remain illiterate. You're determining whether sick people get health care or die from preventable diseases. You're selecting whether young people get employment or remain unemployed. You're picking whether families escape poverty or remain trapped in it. That's the weight of the decision. That's the burden of leadership. That's the responsibility that makes refusing $5 billion so difficult. And they know this. They understand this. They count on this. That's why they make the offer. That's why they present it as a simple choice between pride and pragmatism. That's why they frame it as choosing rhetoric over resources. That's why they suggest you're being selfish by refusing money that could help your people. But here's what they don't tell you. Here's what they deliberately obscure. Here's what they hope you won't realize until it's too late. The cost of accepting their money is higher than the benefit of receiving it. The price of compromising your dignity is steeper than the value of the resources they're offering. The damage to your sovereignty is greater than the development their dollars could fund. Because money builds infrastructure, but dignity builds nations. Resources fund programs, but sovereignty creates futures. Dollars reduce poverty temporarily, but freedom eliminates dependence permanently. When you accept their offer, when you take their money, when you compromise your principles, you're teaching your people a lesson more powerful than any school that money could build. A lesson more lasting than any hospital it could fund. A lesson more destructive than any poverty it could reduce. You're teaching them that dignity has a price, that sovereignty can be purchased, that freedom is negotiable, that principles can be compromised if the offer is sufficient, that who you are matters less than what you can get, that integrity is valuable only until someone offers enough money to buy it. And once that lesson is learned, once that principle is internalized, once that reality is accepted, it spreads, it multiplies, it metastasizes, it infects everything. Your ministers learn it. They start calculating the price of their integrity. They start wondering what they could get in exchange for compromising their principles. They start negotiating their loyalty instead of defending it. Your citizens learn it. They start believing that everything has a price. They start accepting that dignity is negotiable. They start thinking that sovereignty is something you trade for resources rather than something you defend at any cost. Your children learn it. They grow up in a nation where principles are commodities, where dignity is merchandise, where sovereignty is a product to be sold to the highest bidder. And they carry that lesson into the future, into their leadership, into their decisions, into the Burkina Faso they'll inherit and the Africa they'll build. That's the real cost of accepting the IMF's $5 billion, not the stated conditions, not the rhetorical adjustments, not the diplomatic moderation, but the unstated lesson, the unspoken principle, the invisible damage to the soul of a nation. And that cost is too high, that price is too steep, that sacrifice is too great, no matter how much money they offer, no matter how many schools it could build, no matter how many hospitals it could fund, no matter how much poverty it could reduce. Because a nation that trades its dignity for development dollars will never be truly developed. A people who sell their sovereignty for foreign support will never be truly sovereign. A continent that compromises its freedom for comfortable relationships will never be truly free. To the people of Africa, demand this from your leaders. Demand that they value your dignity over development dollars. Demand that they choose your sovereignty over foreign support. Demand that they defend your freedom over comfortable relationships. But understand what you're demanding. Understand the sacrifice you're asking them to make. Understand the difficulty of the choice you're requiring them to face. You're demanding that they refuse resources that could improve your lives. You're asking them to reject money that could fund your schools. You're requiring them to decline support that could build your hospitals. You're insisting they turn down offers that could create your jobs. That's a heavy demand. That's a significant sacrifice. That's a difficult requirement. And you need to be willing to support them when they make that choice. You need to be prepared to endure the consequences when they refuse those offers. You need to be ready to stand with them when they choose dignity over dollars. Because choosing dignity has costs. Real costs, measurable costs, immediate costs. When I refused the IMF's $5 billion, Burkina Faso didn't suddenly become prosperous. Our poverty didn't magically disappear. Our infrastructure didn't instantly improve. Our challenges didn't automatically solve themselves. We remained poor. We continued struggling. We kept facing the same difficulties we'd faced before, except now we faced them without $5 billion that could have helped address them. And my people had to accept that. They had to understand why I'd made that choice. They had to support the decision even though it meant continued hardship. They had to stand with me even though it meant sacrificing resources we desperately needed. Some did. Some understood. Some recognized that dignity matters more than dollars. Some appreciated that sovereignty is worth the sacrifice. Some valued freedom enough to endure the cost. But some didn't. Some were angry. Some felt I'd chosen pride over pragmatism. Some believed I'd sacrificed their welfare for my principles. Some thought I'd been selfish by refusing money that could have helped them. And I understood their anger. I accepted their frustration. I acknowledged their disappointment because they were right that $5 billion could have improved their lives. They were correct that the money could have funded programs they needed. They were accurate that the resources could have addressed challenges they faced. But they were wrong about one thing. They were wrong that accepting that money would have been in their best interest. They were mistaken that compromising our dignity would have served them. They were incorrect that trading our sovereignty for their short-term benefit would have helped them long-term. Because I wasn't just leading for today, I was leading for tomorrow. I wasn't just making decisions for this generation. I was making choices for the next generation. I wasn't just thinking about immediate needs. I was considering long-term consequences. And in the long term, a dignified Burkina Faso serves my people better than a wealthy but compromised Burkina Faso. A sovereign nation with limited resources creates more opportunities than a dependent nation with abundant resources. A free people facing challenges builds a stronger future than a controlled people enjoying comfort. That's what I tried to explain to those who were angry. That's what I attempted to help them understand. That's what I worked to make them see. And gradually, some did. Gradually, some understood. Gradually, some recognized that my refusal wasn't selfish but strategic, that my choice wasn't about pride but about principle, that my decision wasn't sacrificing their welfare but protecting their dignity. But here's what you, the people of Africa, must understand. Your leaders cannot make these choices alone. They cannot refuse these offers without your support. They cannot choose dignity over dollars unless you're willing to endure the consequences of that choice. If you demand that your leaders value dignity but then punish them when that choice means continued poverty, you're making it impossible for them to lead with integrity. If you insist they choose sovereignty but then remove them when that decision means sacrificing resources, you're incentivizing them to compromise. If you require they defend freedom but then replace them when that stand means facing hardship, you're teaching them that principles cost too much. You must be willing to sacrifice with them. You must be prepared to struggle alongside them. You must be ready to endure hardship for the sake of dignity. You must be committed to supporting leaders who choose sovereignty over submission even when that choice means continued challenges. Because the alternative is a cycle of compromise, a pattern of surrender, a system where every African leader learns that refusing Western offers means losing African support, where choosing dignity means facing domestic opposition, where defending sovereignty means political suicide. And if that's the lesson African leaders learn, if that's the reality they face, If that's the choice they confront, they'll compromise, they'll surrender. They'll accept the offers, they'll take the money, they'll trade dignity for dollars, they'll sell sovereignty for support, they'll exchange freedom for comfort. Not because they're weak, not because they're corrupt, not because they don't value dignity, but because they're rational. Because they understand that leading with integrity requires popular support. Because they recognize that choosing principles over resources only works if their people support that choice. So demand integrity from your leaders, but support them when they demonstrate it. Require them to value dignity, but stand with them when that value costs resources. Insist they defend sovereignty, but endure hardship alongside them when that defense means sacrifice. And when they compromise, when they surrender, when they trade your dignity for their comfort, remove them, replace them. Install leaders who understand that some things are priceless, but be specific about what you mean by compromise. Be clear about what constitutes surrender. Be precise about what represents trading dignity for comfort. Because not every negotiation is compromise, not every partnership is surrender, not every relationship is trading dignity. Sometimes engaging with Western powers serves African interests. Sometimes accepting Western support advances African development. Sometimes partnering with Western institutions benefits African people. The question is always, what are the terms? What are the conditions? What is the price? What is being asked in exchange? What is being surrendered? What is being compromised? When the IMF offered me $5 billion in exchange for moderating my rhetoric about Western exploitation, that was compromise, that was surrender, that was trading dignity for dollars. Because they were asking me to stop telling the truth. They were requiring me to pretend exploitation was partnership. They were demanding I demonstrate that sovereignty can be purchased. But when China offered us investment in exchange for cobalt access under terms that respected our sovereignty, that wasn't compromise, that was partnership, that was mutual benefit. Because they weren't asking us to surrender our dignity. They weren't requiring us to compromise our principles. They weren't demanding we stop being who we are. Learn to distinguish between partnerships that respect your dignity and offers that purchase your compliance. Learn to differentiate between investments that serve your interests and bribes that buy your surrender. Learn to recognize when engagement advances your sovereignty and when it compromises it. And hold your leaders accountable for making those distinctions correctly. Remove them when they accept offers that compromise dignity. Replace them when they surrender sovereignty for support. Install new leaders when they trade freedom for comfort, but support them when they refuse those offers. Stand with them when they choose dignity over dollars. Endure sacrifice alongside them when they defend sovereignty at significant cost. Because the future of Africa depends on this, on whether we collectively decide that dignity matters more than development dollars, on whether we agree that sovereignty is worth the sacrifice, on whether we commit to supporting leaders who choose freedom over dependence. The IMF will keep making offers. Western powers will keep presenting packages. Foreign institutions will keep proposing partnerships that require compromise. And African leaders will keep facing choices between dignity and dollars, between sovereignty and support, between freedom and dependence. And the choice they make will depend partly on their integrity, but it will depend equally on whether their people support them when they choose integrity over resources. On whether African citizens stand with leaders who refuse compromising offers, on whether the continent collectively values dignity enough to endure the cost of defending it. I refused $5 billion. My people's dignity was not for sale at that price. It's not for sale at any price, because some things are priceless, and dignity is one of them. But that choice only matters if other African leaders make similar choices, if other nations refuse similar offers, if the entire continent decides collectively that dignity cannot be purchased, that sovereignty cannot be traded, that freedom is worth defending at any cost. And that collective decision only happens if African people demand it, if citizens insist on it, if populations support it, if the continent commits to it. So demand it, insist on it, support it, commit to it, make it clear to your leaders that you value dignity over development dollars, that you choose sovereignty over foreign support, that you defend freedom over comfortable relationships. And when they make that choice, when they refuse those offers, when they choose dignity over dollars, stand with them, support them, endure sacrifice alongside them. Demonstrate that choosing integrity has popular backing. Show that defending sovereignty has citizen support. Prove that valuing dignity has continental commitment. Because that's how we change Africa. Not through one leader's choice, but through collective commitment. Not through individual integrity, but through popular support for that integrity. Not through refusing one offer, but through establishing a continental principle that dignity is not for sale at any price. The IMF offered me $5 billion. I refused. My people's dignity is not for sale. Because the future of Africa depends on this generation, on whether we choose dignity or dollars, whether we choose sovereignty or submission, whether we choose freedom or dependence. The IMF offered me $5 billion. They thought it would be enough. They thought every leader has a price. They thought sovereignty could be purchased. My answer was just one sentence. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. That sentence changed everything, not because it was eloquent, but because it was true, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was honest, not because it was strategic, but because it was right. And truth matters more than eloquence. Honesty matters more than sophistication. Right matters more than strategic. We are Burkina Faso. We are Africa. We are sovereign. And our dignity is not for sale at any price. Not yesterday, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Because we finally remembered something our ancestors always knew, that freedom cannot be purchased, that dignity cannot be negotiated, that sovereignty cannot be traded. It can only be claimed. It can only be defended. It can only be fought for. And we're done negotiating. We're done compromising. We're done calculating the price of our dignity. We're simply standing. We're simply refusing. We're simply free. My people's dignity is not for sale at any price. 11 words, one sentence, everything.